Some people walk into a church searching for God. Others walk in because they have nowhere else to go. I had spent most of my life believing that every problem had a solution. Money solved some. Influence solved others. The rest could usually be handled with patience. That was the lie I told myself anyway. The truth was much simpler. There were things in this world no amount of power could fix. That was why I found myself standing outside St. Matthew's Church on a cold Thursday evening. The city had already begun settling into darkness. Streetlights reflected across wet pavement from a light rain that had passed an hour earlier. The church sat quietly between older brick buildings, almost forgotten by the modern skyline surrounding it. I had not visited in years. Not since my mother's funeral. Yet something pulled me there that night. Maybe memory. Maybe guilt. Maybe loneliness. I stepped inside and immediately noticed the silence. Not the ordinary silence of an empty building. A deeper kind. The kind that made every footstep sound louder than it should. Candlelight flickered along the side walls. Colored light from stained glass windows stretched across the wooden pews. The air carried the faint scent of old wood and melted wax. For a moment I thought I was alone. Then I heard it. A quiet sound. Barely more than a breath. Someone crying. I looked toward the back of the church and saw her. She sat alone in the last pew beneath a stained glass window. Her head was lowered. One hand covered her face. The other held a folded photograph against her chest. She was trying not to cry loudly, trying not to disturb anyone. Even though there was nobody there to disturb, something about that hurt more than the tears themselves. I should have turned around and left. Her pain was none of my business. Instead, I stood there watching for several seconds longer than I should have. She looked young. Late 20s maybe. Simple coat. Brown hair falling loosely over her shoulders. Nothing about her appearance demanded attention. Yet somehow she became the only thing I could see. Eventually I moved toward a pew several rows away and sat down. I kept my distance. The last thing she needed was a stranger asking questions. Minutes passed. Neither of us spoke. The church remained silent except for the occasional sound of her uneven breathing. Then she unfolded the photograph. Even from where I sat I could see it was old. Worn at the corners. Precious. She stared at it for several seconds before another tear slipped down her cheek. I looked away. Grief is a private language. One people should not translate without permission. Yet I could not stop wondering what had brought her there. Who had she lost? What burden was she carrying alone? The questions arrived without invitation. More troubling was the fact that I cared about the answers. After nearly 20 minutes she finally stood. She carefully wiped her eyes and slipped the photograph back into her purse. Then she walked toward the front of the church. A single prayer candle burned beside the altar. She lit another one and stood silently before it. No dramatic gestures. No desperate pleading. Just quiet faith. The kind that survives even when life gives every reason to abandon it. When she finally turned to leave, she passed close enough for me to see her face clearly. Sadness lingered there. But so did strength. She walked out into the night without ever noticing me. The church felt emptier after she left. I remained seated long after the door closed behind her, staring at the candle she had lit, thinking about a woman whose name I did not know, a woman I would probably never see again. At least that was what I told myself. The problem was that some faces refused to disappear. And before I left St. Matthew's Church that night, I already knew hers would be one of them. Some memories fade with time. Others settle into your mind and refuse to leave. 3 days passed after that night at St. Matthew's Church. 3 days of meetings, phone calls, contracts, and obligations. My schedule remained exactly the same. My focus did not. Every quiet moment led me back to the same image. A woman sitting alone beneath stained glass. A folded photograph in trembling hands. Tears she tried desperately to hide. It made no sense. I had seen grief before. More times than I cared to count. Yet, something about her stayed with me. On Monday morning I found myself staring out the office window instead of reviewing reports. The city stretched beneath me in every direction. Thousands of people moving through their lives. Thousands of stories. Somehow I could only think about one. Ethan noticed immediately. He always did. "Something on your mind?" he asked. I considered ignoring the question. Instead, I surprised myself. There was a woman at St. Matthew's Church last week. Ethan waited. And find out who she is. The request hung in the air for several seconds. That is all? He finally asked. That is all. He nodded once and left without another question. By late afternoon, I almost regretted asking. Almost. The truth was that curiosity rarely travels alone. It usually brings concern with it. That evening, rain drifted across the city again. Not a storm. Just a steady gray drizzle. For reasons I could not explain, I drove past St. Matthew's Church on my way home. The parking lot was nearly empty. A few candles glowed through the stained glass windows. Otherwise, nothing seemed different. Yet I found myself slowing down as I passed, looking for someone I knew would not be there. The realization irritated me more than it should have. The next afternoon, Ethan returned carrying a folder. He placed it on my desk. Her name is Grace Bennett. I looked down at the folder but did not open it immediately. The name felt strangely familiar the moment I read it. Grace. Somehow it suited her. 28 years old, Ethan continued. Elementary school teacher. I finally opened the folder. A photograph sat clipped to the front page. The same woman from the church. Except this version looked different. She was standing outside a school building surrounded by children. Smiling. Laughing. Completely unlike the woman I had seen in the last pew. The contrast caught me off guard. What happened? I asked quietly. Ethan understood the question immediately. Her mother passed away 6 months ago. The room became very still. Suddenly the photograph in her hands made sense. The church. The tears. The loneliness. Everything connected. I looked through the rest of the information. Nothing unusual. No scandals. No hidden surprises. Just a simple life. She taught 3rd grade at a public elementary school. Volunteered at community events. Lived alone in the house she inherited from her mother. Paid her bills. Helped people. The kind of person most cities never notice enough. Yet there was one detail that held my attention longer than the rest. Every Thursday evening, she visited St. Matthew's Church. The same church where I had seen her. The same church where my mother used to pray. After Ethan left, I sat alone for nearly an hour staring at the folder. The city outside continued moving. Traffic lights changed. People rushed through their evenings. Somewhere across town, Grace Bennett was living her life completely unaware that a stranger knew her name now. I should have closed the folder and forgotten about her. That would have been the reasonable thing to do. Instead, I found myself looking at the photograph one final time before placing it back inside. Because the more I learned about her, the less she felt like a stranger. And the more I realized that seeing her in that church had not been the end of a story. It had been the beginning. People rarely notice when someone is carrying too much weight. The strongest ones become experts at hiding it. Over the next few weeks, I learned more about Grace Bennett than I expected. Not because I asked for constant updates. In fact, after receiving the initial report, I told Ethan to stop. The problem was that once a person enters your thoughts, you start noticing them everywhere. Especially when you are looking for reasons not to. One Thursday afternoon, I found myself parked across the street from Jefferson Elementary School. The dismissal bell had rung 15 minutes earlier. Children poured through the front doors carrying backpacks almost as large as they were. Parents waved from cars. Teachers stood near the entrance offering final reminders and goodbyes. Grace was among them. She knelt beside a young student struggling with a shoelace. While other adults hurried home, she stayed behind until the child smiled and ran toward his waiting father. Then she helped another student carry a science project to a car. Then another. Small acts. Nothing dramatic. Yet she treated every child as though they mattered. Maybe that was why they trusted her so easily. I watched for a few minutes before leaving. The image followed me throughout the evening. Later that night, I passed her street on the way to another meeting. Her house sat at the end of a quiet block lined with aging maple trees. A porch light glowed softly near the front steps. The place looked older than the surrounding homes. Well cared for but tired. Much like the woman living inside it. The following week brought another Thursday. Without planning to, I returned to St. Matthew's Church. Part of me expected not to find her there. Instead, she was sitting in the same pew beneath the stained glass window. This time she was not crying. She simply sat in silence holding the same photograph. The afternoon sunlight filtered through colored glass, casting blue and gold patterns across the wooden bench. For several minutes, she stared toward the altar without moving. Then she bowed her head and closed her eyes. Prayer. Or maybe a conversation with someone she missed. Watching her stirred memories I had spent years avoiding. My mother had prayed in that church every week. Even during difficult times. Especially during difficult times. She used to say faith was not about having answers. It was about finding strength when answers never arrived. I had not believed her then. Sitting there now, I wondered if Grace did. After she left, I remained behind and spoke briefly with Father Michael. The elderly priest had known my family for years. We exchanged polite conversation before he glanced toward the church door. "She comes often," he said. I knew immediately who he meant. Grace. He nodded. Good heart. Carries more sadness than someone her age should. I looked toward the empty pew where she had been sitting. Does she have family? Very little now. His answer lingered. Very little now. Sometimes a few words reveal more than entire biographies. As the weeks continued, a pattern emerged. Grace taught during the day. Helped at community events whenever she could. Visited the church each Thursday. Returned home to a life that seemed increasingly solitary. Yet she never complained, never asked for help, never expected anything from anyone. Then one Friday evening, Ethan called unexpectedly. His voice sounded unusually serious. "I thought you should know something." I remained silent. The house she inherited from her mother is in financial trouble. I looked out across the city lights beyond my office window. What kind of trouble? A brief pause followed. Then came the answer. The kind that does not disappear on its own. And for reasons I could not fully explain, that concerned me far more than it should have. Problems rarely arrive one at a time. They gather quietly in the background until a person suddenly realizes they are surrounded. After Ethan's phone call, I spent the rest of the evening staring at city lights instead of reading the reports stacked across my desk. Financial trouble could mean many things. An overdue payment, a repair bill, a temporary setback. The next morning I learned it was far worse. The house Grace inherited from her mother carried years of accumulated expenses. Medical bills from her mother's illness. Property taxes that had steadily increased. Maintenance costs on an aging home. Individually, none of them would have been devastating. Together, they had become a storm. Grace was doing everything she could to keep up. Teaching during the day. Tutoring students after school for extra income, cutting expenses wherever possible. Yet the numbers continued moving in the wrong direction. What bothered me most was not the debt itself. It was the fact that nobody seemed to know she was struggling. Grace carried the burden alone. The following week I saw it for myself. She left school later than usual and drove directly to a small grocery store. Nothing remarkable about that. Except I noticed her standing in one aisle for nearly 5 minutes comparing prices between two nearly identical items. Eventually she chose the cheaper option and placed it carefully into her cart. Then she repeated the same process in another aisle. And another. The sight stayed with me. People imagine hardship as something dramatic. Most of the time it looks much simpler. It looks like counting every dollar. It looks like hesitation. It looks like sacrifice nobody else notices. That Thursday, she returned to the church. I arrived several minutes after she did. This time I remained farther back than before. The evening sun streamed through the stained glass windows, painting the sanctuary with soft colors. Grace sat in her usual place. The photograph rested in her hands again. For a long time she said nothing. Then she spoke quietly. Not loudly enough for anyone else to hear. Just enough to remind me that grief never completely leaves. It simply changes shape. When she finally stood, she walked toward the altar and lit a prayer candle. Her expression looked different than before. Still sad. Still tired. But there was something else now. Worry. The kind of worry that steals sleep. The kind that follows people home. After she left, Father Michael approached me. "You seem to visit more often these days." I smiled faintly. "Maybe I am getting older." The priest laughed softly. Then his expression grew thoughtful. Grace has had a difficult year. I looked toward the candle she had lit. I know. He nodded slowly. She never asks for help. Somehow that surprised me less than it should have. Grace seemed exactly like the type of person who would carry an impossible burden rather than inconvenience someone else. The next morning, Ethan arrived with several folders and a familiar look. There may be a solution, he said. I already knew I should not ask what kind. I asked anyway. He placed a document on my desk. A financial summary. Detailed. Accurate. Concerning. The amount required to stabilize Grace's situation was significant for most people. For me, it was barely noticeable. The realization created a problem I had not expected. Because for the first time since seeing her in that church, I was no longer wondering whether I could help. I was wondering whether I should. And as I stared at the paperwork in front of me, I realized the answer had already begun forming long before I asked the question. The most difficult decisions are not the ones that cost money. They are the ones that reveal who you are when nobody is watching. For 3 days, the documents remained on my desk. I reviewed them more times than necessary. Not because the numbers were complicated. They were not. The situation was painfully clear. Grace was falling behind. Slowly. Quietly. Consistently. Every month became a little harder than the one before it. Every unexpected expense pushed her closer to a future she could not afford. Yet somehow she kept moving forward. Teaching children. Volunteering in the community. Visiting St. Matthew's Church each Thursday. Carrying her grief and her worries without asking anyone to carry them with her. Most people would have given up by now. Grace did not seem to know how. On the 4th morning, I made a decision. Ethan entered my office just after sunrise. He looked at the folder on my desk and immediately understood. You want to help. It was not a question. Yes. Directly. I looked out toward the city beyond the glass. No hice nada. He knew why. Grace had too much pride to accept charity from a stranger. More importantly, helping her was not about gratitude. It was about giving her room to breathe. Nothing more. Over the next several days, a plan quietly took shape. Legal channels. Anonymous assistance. Financial corrections that would appear ordinary to anyone reviewing them. No dramatic gestures. No surprises large enough to raise suspicion. Just enough to stop the downward spiral. Then something unexpected happened. Before any of the arrangements were finalized, Grace received a letter. I learned about it later that evening. She opened it while sitting at her kitchen table. The letter informed her that a long-disputed insurance reimbursement, connected to her mother's medical care, had finally been approved for review. Not approved. Not guaranteed. Simply reopened. The timing was fortunate. Extremely fortunate. Grace spent several minutes staring at the paper before reading it again. Then a third time. Hope can be a dangerous thing when people have been disappointed too often. They stop trusting good news. The following Thursday, she returned to the church carrying the letter in her purse. I recognized the difference immediately. She still looked tired. But the hopelessness I had seen during previous visits seemed lighter somehow. She sat in her usual pew beneath the stained glass window and unfolded the letter several times throughout the evening, reading the same words, searching for reassurance, looking for certainty where none yet existed. At one point, Father Michael approached her briefly. They exchanged a few quiet words. Grace smiled. The first genuine smile I had seen inside those church walls. It lasted only a moment, yet it changed the entire room. After she left, I remained seated for a long time, watching the prayer candle she lit before leaving, thinking about how little it sometimes takes to keep a person moving forward. Not solutions. Not miracles. Just hope. The next week brought another small change. A local educational foundation unexpectedly selected Grace for a classroom improvement grant she had applied for nearly a year earlier. The amount was modest. Nothing life-changing. But enough to ease several financial pressures. Enough to remind her that good things still existed. Watching everything unfold created a strange feeling I could not fully explain. Satisfaction, perhaps. Relief. Maybe something more dangerous. Because each time I saw her smile, I found myself caring a little more than I intended. And each time I reminded myself to keep my distance, the distance seemed harder to maintain. Then, on a quiet Thursday evening as the last sunlight filtered through stained glass, Grace looked toward the front of the church and whispered a prayer. I could not hear the words. But for the first time since I had seen her there, she no longer looked completely alone. The troubling part was realizing that somehow, neither did I. Sometimes the universe whispers before it speaks. Looking back, I think that was exactly what was happening. Small changes. Ting moments. Quiet signs that something larger was moving beneath the surface of our lives. Weeks passed after the insurance review and the classroom grant. Grace continued teaching. Continued visiting St. Matthew's Church every Thursday. Continued carrying herself with the same quiet determination that had first captured my attention. Yet something had changed. She was beginning to notice the pattern. One evening, Ethan entered my office carrying several documents. There is a problem, he said. The words immediately drew my attention. What kind of problem? Grace is asking questions. I leaned back slowly. About what? About the timing. That did not surprise me as much as it should have. Grace was kind, but she was not naive. Anyone paying attention would eventually notice how several unrelated difficulties had started improving at exactly the moment they seemed impossible to solve. The insurance review. The grant. A delayed property tax penalty that had suddenly been reconsidered. None of the events were large enough to reveal the truth. Together, however, they formed a pattern. A few days later, I saw evidence of it myself. Grace arrived at the church carrying a small notebook. During her usual visit, she spent several minutes reviewing pages filled with handwritten notes. Dates. Numbers. Names. Questions. Not the behavior of someone accepting events at face value. The behavior of someone searching for answers. After she lit her prayer candle, she remained seated longer than usual. Her gaze drifted repeatedly toward the front of the sanctuary, where Father Michael organized several donation envelopes. Eventually she stood and approached him. Their conversation remained private, but I could tell she was asking something important. Father Michael listened carefully before answering. Then he smiled and gently shook his head. Whatever answer she expected, she did not receive it. As she walked back toward the exit, confusion lingered on her face. Not frustration. Curiosity. For some reason I found myself smiling. Most people stop asking questions when life becomes easier. Grace seemed determined to understand why. The following week brought another surprise. A severe storm moved through the city one Tuesday night. Heavy rain battered rooftops. Powerful winds bent tree branches across entire neighborhoods. The next morning, reports of damage appeared throughout the area. Several homes experienced flooding. Others lost power. Grace's neighborhood was among the hardest hit. When I heard the news, concern arrived immediately. Ethan gathered information before I even asked. By late afternoon, we learned that a large tree had fallen across part of Grace's property. Fortunately, the house itself remained unharmed. The repair costs, however, would not be insignificant. I expected despair. Instead, what I witnessed astonished me. Grace spent the entire weekend helping neighbors clear debris before addressing her own property. She carried branches, distributed water, checked on elderly residents, organized volunteers. Even while facing her own challenges, she focused on everyone else first. Standing across the street, watching her move from house to house beneath the afternoon sun, I finally understood something that had been growing inside me for months. This was never about rescuing Grace. Grace was already stronger than most people I had ever known. The truth was much harder to admit. Somewhere between the church, the prayers, and the countless quiet acts of kindness, she had become the person reminding me who I used to be. And as I watched her laugh with neighbors despite everything she carried, I realized that finding her had changed far more than her future. It had begun changing mine. The answers we search for are rarely hidden. Most of the time they are standing directly in front of us, waiting until we are ready to see them. By the beginning of autumn, Grace's life looked different from the one I had first observed months earlier. The constant shadow of financial disaster no longer hung over every decision. Her classroom had new supplies. The house remained standing. The insurance review continued moving forward. From the outside, everything appeared to be improving. Yet something else had taken its place. Questions. More specifically, one question. Why? Grace had spent months accepting unexpected blessings. Now she wanted to understand where they came from. The first sign appeared on a Thursday evening. She arrived at St. Matthew's Church carrying the same notebook I had noticed before. After lighting a prayer candle, she sat beneath the stained glass window and began reviewing pages filled with notes. Occasionally she crossed something out. Occasionally she added new observations. The expression on her face reminded me of one of her students trying to solve a difficult puzzle. Determined, focused, unwilling to quit. When Father Michael approached her afterward, their conversation lasted longer than usual. The priest listened carefully while Grace spoke. Then he glanced across the sanctuary. For a brief moment, his eyes settled in my direction. Not long enough to reveal anything. Long enough to make me uncomfortable. Grace noticed the movement immediately. Her gaze followed his. Fortunately, I had already stepped into a side aisle beyond her view. Still, the moment lingered. She was getting closer. A few days later, Ethan walked into my office carrying another update. She has been asking questions around town. I set aside the document I was reading. What kind of questions? About donations, grants, community programs, anyone who may have influenced recent decisions. I sighed quietly. And nobody has given her answers. That was true. The arrangements had been designed carefully. Every action followed legitimate channels. Every opportunity existed on its own merit. The only thing I had done was ensure certain doors remained open. Yet the more Grace investigated, the more she seemed convinced someone was standing behind them. Then came the moment neither of us expected. On a cool Saturday afternoon, St. Matthew's hosted a community fundraiser for local families. Grace volunteered as she often did. So did dozens of other people. I attended as a donor, remaining mostly in the background. The event filled the church courtyard with laughter, music, and conversation. Families gathered around folding tables. Children played games. Volunteers served food. Everything felt ordinary. Until Grace saw me. For several seconds she simply stared. Not because she recognized me. Because she had seen me before without realizing it. At the church. More than once. Our eyes met across the courtyard. Something shifted in her expression. Recognition. Curiosity. Realization. She began walking toward me. I should have left. Instead, I stayed exactly where I was. The distance between us slowly disappeared. When she finally stopped a few feet away, the noise of the crowd seemed to fade. I know you, she said softly. Her voice carried certainty rather than confusion. I nodded once. We have seen each other before. Grace studied my face carefully. You were there. Not a question. Fact. The stained glass windows. The prayer candles. The quiet evenings. She remembered. For the first time since this story began, we stood face to face. No church pews separating us. No distance. Nos a dos. And as Grace looked directly into my eyes, I realized the question she was about to ask might change everything. Some truths arrive gently. Others change the direction of your life the moment they are spoken aloud. The crowd continued moving around us, but neither of us seemed to notice. Grace stood a few feet away, her eyes searching my face as though pieces of a puzzle were finally beginning to fit together. You were there, she repeated quietly. I nodded. Yes. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then she surprised me. Every Thursday. Again, not a question. A realization. Most Thursdays, I admitted. A faint smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. I thought I was imagining that. I found myself smiling in return. You were not. The noise of the fundraiser gradually returned around us. Children laughed near the game booths. Volunteers carried boxes between tables. Somewhere behind us, music drifted from a small speaker. Yet the conversation felt strangely separate from everything else. Grace folded her arms lightly. Why? There it was. The question I had been expecting for months. The question that deserved an honest answer. I looked toward the church doors before speaking. The first time I saw you, you were sitting alone. Her expression softened immediately. She knew exactly which evening I meant. You looked like someone carrying more than anyone should carry by themselves. Grace lowered her eyes briefly. That was not my best day. I know. Another silence followed. Comfortable this time. Thoughtful. Then she looked back at me. Did you know who I was? Not that night. But later. I nodded once. Grace exhaled slowly. Instead of anger, I saw curiosity. Instead of suspicion, understanding. And all those things that happened afterward? She asked. The insurance review. The grant. The other opportunities. I hesitated. Not because I regretted anything. Because I wanted to choose the right words. Some doors were already there, I said. I only made sure they stayed open. Her eyes widened slightly. For several seconds she simply stared at me. Then she laughed softly. Not because anything was funny. Because the answer confirmed what she had suspected all along. I knew it, she whispered. Part of me knew it. I expected frustration. Maybe disappointment. Instead, Grace surprised me once again. Why would you do that for someone you did not even know? The question landed deeper than she realized. Because the answer was not simple anymore. Months earlier I might have said sympathy, or kindness, or responsibility. Those answers no longer felt complete. At first, I said carefully, I thought I was helping you. Grace listened without interrupting. Then I started paying attention. I glanced toward the stained glass windows visible through the church entrance. I watched how you treated people. Your students. Your neighbors. Complete strangers. She looked away, embarrassed by the compliment. Anyone would do that. No, I said quietly. They would not. The words seemed to affect her more than I expected. For a moment, neither of us looked away. The afternoon sunlight reflected across the church courtyard, casting warm gold across the stone walkway between us. Then Grace asked the one question I had never answered honestly, even to myself. So why did you keep coming back? I smiled faintly. Because after all this time the truth finally felt simple. Because every time I saw you, I said, I remembered the person I wanted to be. For the first time since I had met her, tears filled Grace's eyes. Not from grief. Not from loss. Something softer. Something brighter. And standing there beneath the shadow of the church that had brought our lives together, I realized neither of us was searching for answers anymore. We were finally finding them. 1 year can change a life without changing a single memory. The following autumn arrived with cooler mornings, golden leaves, and sunlight that seemed softer than before. St. Matthew's Church looked exactly the same from the outside. The stone walls remained unchanged. The stained glass windows still caught the afternoon light. The prayer candles still flickered beside the altar. Yet everything felt different to me. Perhaps because I was different. Grace and I never rushed toward anything. There were no grand declarations. No dramatic promises. Life had already taught us the value of patience. Instead, we built something steady. Something real. Thursday evenings remained ours. Sometimes we sat quietly inside the church. Sometimes we walked through the neighborhood afterward. Sometimes we talked for hours. Other times we simply enjoyed the comfort of not needing to fill every silence. Grace continued teaching. Her classroom became one of the most beloved in the district. Children adored her. Parents trusted her. She never changed the things that made her extraordinary. She still remembered birthdays. Still volunteered for community events. Still found ways to help people who could offer nothing in return. Watching her became one of my favorite parts of life. Not because she was perfect. Because she was genuine. In a world filled with people trying to become more, Grace somehow made everyone around her feel enough. The insurance review eventually ended in her favor. The financial pressure that had shadowed her life for so long finally disappeared. Repairs were completed on the house she inherited from her mother. The garden bloomed again. The front porch where she once sat alone became a place filled with laughter and conversation. One afternoon she showed me an old photograph. The same photograph she had carried into the church that first night. The edges were still worn. The image was still faded. Her mother smiled from the picture exactly as she always had. Grace looked down at it before speaking. I used to come to the church because I thought I was losing everything. I listened quietly. Now I come because I remember everything I still have. The words stayed with me long after she said them. Few weeks later, we attended a community gathering at the church courtyard. Families filled the space. Children ran between tables. Music drifted through the cool afternoon air. Father Michael stood near the entrance greeting everyone with his usual warmth. At one point, Grace stepped away to help organize a donation table. I remained near the church doors watching the crowd. Father Michael joined me. "She changed your life." It was not a question. I smiled. "She did." The priest nodded thoughtfully. "Funny how that works." I followed his gaze toward Grace. She was laughing with a group of students and their parents. Sunlight illuminated her face. For the first time since I had known her, there was no sadness hiding behind her smile. Only peace. "I spent years looking for purpose," I admitted quietly. "Turns out I found it sitting in the last pew." Father Michael laughed softly before excusing himself. As the afternoon continued, Grace returned and stood beside me. Without saying anything, she slipped her hand into mine. A simple gesture. Yet somehow it meant everything. Together we looked toward the stained glass windows glowing beneath the setting sun. The same windows that had witnessed grief, questions, hope, healing. And in that moment, I finally understood something my mother tried to teach me long ago. Sometimes the answer to a prayer is not a miracle. Sometimes it is another person. A broken soul meeting another broken soul at exactly the right time. And together finding the light.